Hello friends, welcome to this module on more Servlet API, and basically in this module we will be developing a base servlet which can be used in any application, and later we will try to realize, oh, we have something similar from the API which is the generic servlet. So basically here we are trying to understand the things related to the class called generic servlet in HTTP. Fine. So this is actually part of javax.servlet package. Okay, fine. In the earlier module, we have developed our first servlet class, fine, which was the hello servlet. Okay, something to look at. What was done there? Did we do anything much in the init method? What was the init method like? It was just used for initializing the servlet config instance variable. Fine. Whenever you have to write an implementation of a servlet, since we have to implement the get servlet config method, we would have an instance variable. Init method should do the initialization. Fine. So that is something which should always be there in any servlet you like, any servlet which you write. Fine. Init method, destroy method, fine, almost. Okay, destroy method most of the time may not you may not be doing much, fine. So it was a blank implementation which you have done in the earlier one. Okay, so can we do something by which we can write an implementation, we can create some base class, fine, instead of writing all those methods implementation, a blank implementation for destroy, init method which is almost going to be similar in all cases, fine, and maybe even the get servlet info. Okay, fine, we can have some kind of a base class which we can create, so that if we have to create any new servlet anytime, we just simply extend and only override a few of those. Most of the time it may be only the service method which we would like to override, and that is the one which is doing the job for us most of the time. Fine, how to process a request coming from us from a client and giving a response back to it. That is a responsibility which is given to the service method, and which is the main job. So that is something which is going to be different. But the few other things, most of the time there is more common things which most of the time are going to remain almost the same thing. So let us do this exercise, that is, we will create our own base class. Fine, we will create a base servlet which can be used in any application. Fine. So let us see how we go about it. Okay, so fine. So fine, and one more thing what we can do here is, okay, we had the servlet interface being implemented in our hello servlet. So 5 methods would definitely be there. Fine. This base class we can keep it abstract, and where only thing to be overridden in the subclass would be which would compulsorily be overridden in the subclass would be the service method. We can leave that to be an abstract, so everyone would be forced to provide their own service method, but other methods, some basic implementations we can give. We can add more utility methods which we understand are going to be quite useful. Fine, mainly the utility methods can be those, fine, which can be, if you have to use some methods from the servlet config, or we will have to call the get servlet config and then invoke those methods, or rather than that we can provide the same methods right in our base servlet itself, so directly you can use them. So let us see how we can go about creating a implementation of a base servlet. Fine. So let us start with this implementation of a base servlet class. Okay, so fine, we can have our own. Okay, we can again start with the similar package as what we did in the hello servlet. So we start with the declaration of a package. We can keep it in the package called org.epgpathshala.servlet. Okay, what we will need, yes, similar to what was done in the hello servlet, here also we will need the import for, so we will use the same import declarations, that is import javax.servlet.star, and another import is import java.io.star. Those two things will be needed. And then yes, let's see what's the next thing. Okay, we write implementations. Yes, here also we'll have our everywhere, since we have to implement the get servlet config, we'll be having our private variable similar to what was done earlier. We'll have our private variable of type servlet config. Let's give the variable name as config. Okay, fine. And then writing the implementation. Okay, so what we can do for implementation? Implementation of the init method. Okay, one more thing. We know this is being created as a base servlet where everyone will be doing a subclassing, right? One thing which is very important for us is the initialization of the servlet config, which must be done. Fine, fine. So I would like the init method implementation to be a final one. Fine, where I do the initialization. Fine. In order to have some additional initialization during the init, fine, which others may like to add, a subclass would like to do it, we can add another method. Let's give the same name as init, but this can be without any parameters. So what we do here is, yes, we make this as a final method. We have our final method. So we'll have a public final, return is void, init, parameter will be servlet config. It does two things. It is going to, first part is it has to initialize the instance variable for config. So it says this dot config equal to config, and second thing is we'll be invoking a method here called init. Init will be the method which will not have final. So others can, any additional initialization which the subclass may like to do, he can do it in the init method. Fine, and we would prevent overriding of this init method which is having servlet config as a parameter. Fine. So by this, yes, we are ensuring that our config object will always be initialized. Fine, not leaving it for a subclass to do a super or something like that. Fine. So we have our implementation of init method which takes servlet config as a parameter. Fine, doing just two things. Fine, initializing the config variable, and second is calling the other init method. And here is our code for the other init method, which is a very simple one. We are allowing this to be overridden by a subclass. Therefore, this would simply be a blank implementation. It would be public, returns void, name of the method is init, no parameters. Fine, and we can simply have, we can leave it blank. This is something which can be overridden in the subclasses. If they want to put some initialization, or they can always do something, or they do not want any additional thing to be done during initialization, it is fine. Okay, so fine. So here we have the we have one additional method as compared to what was there in the hello servlet. Okay, next what we do is, yes, we will have the method for the get servlet config method. Now get servlet config again, there is no need for anyone to ever override this. We can again have our get servlet config method to be a final method. Right. So just the same implementation, but here we would like to keep it final in order to prevent someone from playing around with what should be written by servlet config. Fine. So if we can make our get servlet config to be a final method, that would be a better implementation. Fine, for to be there as a in the base servlet. Fine. Next, we leave the abstract method service to be an abstract method. Oh, another important thing. Recollect what we have in the servlet config. The servlet config object provides those 4 methods. Fine. So if someone is interested in knowing the class name, someone is interested in using those init parameters, what he'll have to do? Everywhere he has to use the code get servlet config dot get class name, or get servlet config dot get init parameter names, or get init parameter, or get servlet config dot get servlet context. So fine, we can prevent that kind of extra coding if we provide the methods of servlet config in our base servlet itself. So one thing let us do here is to make it more user friendly, more friendlier. Our base servlet could include the methods of servlet config right in the base servlet itself. So what we do is, let us make the change. Okay, we declared public class base servlet implement servlets. That's what we had declared. Okay, let us have it implements not only the servlet, but also the servlet config. Fine. So, we have our public class base servlet implements servlet comma servlet config. So, and let us now include those methods here. Fine, those method implementations are quite simple. Fine, we are just simply forwarding it to the servlet config, which we have got already. So, what we do here, yes, we can write the implementation of each of those methods, starting with the get servlet class. Okay. So, we have public string get servlet class. Okay. Oh, let us keep this also final. We do not want someone to play around with these methods. So, all these 4 methods we can make them final, right. Okay. So, we have public final return type string, method name is get servlet class, no parameters, and what is the code here? We have the this dot config dot. So, we simply say return this dot config dot get servlet class. We are just forwarding it to the config object which we already have. Fine. Same way, we have the next method of the servlet config, which is get init parameter fine, get init parameter names, returning enumeration of string. Okay. So, we will make this final again. So, we have public final returns enumeration of string, fine, get init parameter names, no parameters, fine, implementation again just forward it to the servlet config object. So, it would be return this dot config dot get init parameter names. Similarly, we can also do the coding for get init parameter. It is again a final, fine, we can have this also as a final method. So, we have public final method returns a string, get init parameter takes a string as parameter, implementation is return this dot config dot get init parameter, and parameter is whatever is the parameter here. We have name here as a parameter, p name. Okay, let us repeat p name here in the invocation. Fine. So, that is the implementation of 3 of those methods. Oh, we have one more method, that is a get servlet context. Okay, again this also can be the final method here. So, we have public final servlet context is what we will return. So, return type is servlet context, get servlet context as a method, fine, and simple. Again on similar lines we just simply write it as return this dot config dot get init get servlet context, fine. So, fine, those are the implementations as far as the servlet config is concerned. Okay, let us make it still better by including a few more convenient methods. What we have, okay, as far as that servlet context, oh, we have seen the servlet context interface earlier. It represents nothing but our web application. It is used for our interaction with the web container. Okay. Now, what we have as far as web container is concerned, a few methods. Let me introduce a few other useful methods on the servlet context here. Okay. In servlet context, as far as a web container is concerned, web container has a facility to maintain a log. The web container maintains its log, and it has a facility by which an application, a web component, fine, like our servlet, can, if it wishes, can also put its entry into our into the log which is maintained by the container. Oh, that method is available in the servlet context interface. So, we have this method called log, which is defined in our servlet context interface. So, we have log method, that it's overloaded method. So, we have one method of log which will take as parameter a message which you would like to put in the log. Okay, fine. So, when it is making an entry in the log, yes, there will be a timestamp and the message would be logged, fine. So, you can log a message, or many times you might have some exceptions being thrown somewhere and you might have written a trackage block, and if you want to log your exceptions which have occurred, we have another log method being overloaded where it can take 2 parameters. It can take a message as well as an exception object, the throwable object, type is throwable. And so, these 2 are methods of servlet context. Okay, it would be convenient to have these methods also as part of our base servlet. Okay, fine. Again, it is better to keep them final. We do not want people to play around with our methods, fine, in the subclasses. These are methods we do not want anyone to play around with, Fine. The methods, yes, there are those methods which where we would allow people to override. We don't want every method to be overridden. So one of those methods was the init without any parameters. Fine. So that's something which we never declared final. But most of the methods, fine, to be a good to be writing a base class, right? You should take care. You should look at everything, right? How people might misuse your classes. Fine. So from that point of view, to prevent misuses, we try to go for final methods here. Fine. So that's one of the reasons we are doing this, having those methods to be final. Okay. So fine, let's proceed. So we would like the logging to be available right in the base class, base servlet itself. So let's add our method. Fine. Similar method, exactly same method. Fine. So we have this method called a public method, return type void. Let's use them, but this will also be final. Yeah. So it's public final, return type void, method name is log, parameter can be a string, the message, and then within that what's the code? We already have a method called get Servlet Context in this. So we can simply use get Servlet Context dot log the message, which is the parameter here. Fine. So that should be the implementation for one of the log methods. Exactly on similar lines, we can also write the implementation of the next log method, which has two parameters, and simply we are forwarding this method also, we are keeping it as final. So we got these two log methods also as final methods. Fine. Then coming to what are the other methods remaining? We have the destroy method. Fine. Destroy method. Okay. By default in the base class, we don't want to do anything. Let it be overridden if someone wants, right? So we can leave the destroy method to be. Will not have this as final. We have public method, return type void, destroy method, not doing anything, similar to what was done in the hello servlet. Fine. So exactly similar method here. Fine. We are leaving it for someone to override it and specify if he wants to do anything during the whenever the servlet is going offline. Fine. When the servlet is being taken out of service. Okay. So we have this methods being implemented. Okay. What we have also done here is we have not written any implementation for service method, leaving it abstract for the subclasses to override and specify their implementation. So of course our class here, this class, the base servlet is going to be an abstract class. So we can change that declaration, initial declaration. It has to be public abstract class base servlet. Yes, we leave it. It is implementing servlet as well as servlet config. Fine. Going further with our methods. Okay. One of the other methods which is part of the, because we are implementing the servlet interface, another method which we would be overriding would be the method called get servlet info. Fine. So here is our implementation for get servlet info. This again we leave it open for overriding. It's simply returning a string. Fine. Where people might return a copyright message. Here we can leave it to return a blank string. Fine. A string with 0 length. So here is our implementation for that. Public method return string. Method name is get servlet info. No parameters. Fine. The code is return and we have a blank string, empty string. Fine. So that's the implementation of the methods here. Fine. Which we want for our base servlet. Fine. Clear? So now we look at this class. Yes, it's a good class for an implementation of a base servlet. Now onwards, if we want to write any servlet, we don't have to write implementation of a servlet interface and have to be implementing all the 5 methods. We can simply use, we can write our, if we want to write any servlet class now onwards, what we could do is we could say, okay, so we want to write a new class. So let's say we have a new servlet. So we want to write a class called new servlet. We will simply say, okay, let me have a public class called new servlet, which extends from base servlet. Base servlet is a good class as a base class. Fine. And within this, we should be able to use all those good methods which are available in servlet config, those methods for logging. Fine. Plus, of course, it's also the implementation of the methods of the servlet interface. Fine. So that's one part of it. So yeah, it's a good class. Fine. We wish it was available as part of the API. so that we don't have to again and again include in each and every time I develop a new application. I don't need to be putting this class everywhere, right? It is something which I feel should have been there in the API as part of the API. Let us go through the API. Let us see something. Is something similar existing for us? Aha, here. Here it is. We have this in javax.servlet package. In the classes list, I see this class called generic servlet. Let us see what is it. Here. We find all those methods what we have coded, they are there. So we actually coded the class called generic servlet, which is part of the API. Just see how simple it is. There are a few differences between what is there in the generic servlet and what we coded. Okay, what we have coded is actually a better version than what is there in the API, which is the generic servlet. What we have done is we have created a class which is much safer to use as a base class. We have made those methods final where it matters. Find the initialization init with servlet config as parameter. See, yes, we have generic servlet most commonly because it is part of the API. Yes, most commonly if people have to write a servlet, they can start by not implementing the servlet as an interface, but by extending from the generic servlet class and then going ahead with overriding the service method, going ahead with overriding the init without parameters. But we see that init with parameter also is not been made final. So someone could actually be doing that. But yes, if you read the API carefully, it just mentions it, though it has not done that, it has not done its job properly. Fine. It does mention that, if you want to override this method, please do a super.init so that you do not forget the initialization of the servlet config which is happening through the super class. Okay, fine. So rather than doing it as a comment, a comment within the documentation, it would have been a better idea if the method itself was final. They could have prevented it. Fine. Similar things are applicable to the other methods which we actually made final. None of the methods here they have made final. It would have been a better idea if that is what was done here. Okay, so now we see two different ways of writing a servlet. What are the two ways? One is you could be overriding the you could write your own implementation of the servlet interface by implementing each and every method as you write. Or another option is, which is a better option is, yes, you could write your class by extending from the generic servlet class. Yes, generic servlet is from the API, but if you feel better, you could use that base servlet which we created instead of the generic servlet. Of course, what will have to be done is you will have to carry it in every application which you write. It is not built into the API itself. So, it will not be available every time, right. You will have to carry that class wherever you go for it. Fine. So, here is fine. So, what we have seen here is another way of creating different ways of creating implementation of servlet. Fine. So, fine, that is it. Okay. So, fine, here we have seen about the generic servlet as a one more class within the API. Fine. Of course, let us discuss a few other things which are remaining as far as the servlet request is concerned. And in the earlier module, yes, we did see some of the methods from the servlet request. Fine. So, let us look at some other methods which are useful methods, and they are all fine. They are going to be used in lot of places, and especially if there is a good design. Fine. We do not want the servlet to do all the processing, one servlet doing all the processing as well as the presentation part, because yes, of course, what is the role of our servlet here? It has been entrusted with the role of acting as a single point where a request would come and being responsible for giving a response. Fine. It is the same object which has to be generating the response. Now, one component doing processing of the whole request as well as giving the response to it. Or instead of that, maybe we might like to distribute that job into more than one servlet. So, we got certain options here which are possible by using some of the methods from the servlet request. So, let us look at a few other useful advanced methods from the servlet request interface here. Okay. So, in the servlet request, yes, earlier when we saw about servlet request, we had seen that servlet request should have parameters. So, we had methods for extracting the parameters. We have also seen that we have methods for reading the content which comes as part of a request. Fine. There are more things available to us here. Okay. What is possible here is, it is possible for someone that yes, whenever a request comes to a servlet, servlet may do its own processing, but as far as giving the response back to the container is concerned, yeah, giving the response back to the container, no, there is nothing like giving a response back to the container, but filling the response, filling the buffer of the response with the content to be delivered, fine, that is something which was to be done. Oh, we can have that job being done by a separate servlet, fine. Fine. It may be that it is not only for the purpose of giving response, there might be some more operations. So, as part of processing, the request comes to one servlet, the servlet does its own job, but then it says, okay, I have done my job, let there be another servlet to do further more processing on this. Fine. There can be multiple servlets to which the same request and response objects, I want them to change hands here. A particular request which is given to the servlet by the container, this servlet says I have done my job and let the request and response be forwarded to another servlet, do its processing and give a response back, or maybe it can still further pass it on to someone else. So, we have such a mechanism available here. Okay, there are two important things which can happen here. Even while giving a response, maybe there is a servlet which started writing a response, and then while writing the response, part of the response it has filled into the content. Then it feels it is not my job, let some of the part of the response be included by using a different servlet. Let me have another servlet which would also append some more things into the same buffer object, and then I will continue further filling more things into it. Such mechanisms are available to us. So, let us see what is available, how we can achieve these things. That is, two things we saw. One is sharing the same response object, allowing a different servlet to append more content into what I have already written, and another thing is saying, okay, I am not going to write any content, let there be someone else who takes care of the content part, I am forwarding it further. So, we have two things, one is including content or forwarding the request to someone else to take care of giving a response to it. Okay, so, let us see what we have, what is the object available for this. So, what we have here is in the Servlet API, we have this interface called Requestdispatcher, fine, and it is the servlet request which can give us the object of a Requestdispatcher, fine. So, one option is to use a servlet request to get a Requestdispatcher. There is another way of creating a Requestdispatcher, which is by using the Servlet Context object, fine. But anyway, in both cases, fine, in both the cases we would still be interested in forwarding our request or including something from a different resource. So, we have resource on our server side. It is like, normally a client is the one who is accessing a resource, but now is the time where on the server side itself, within the same application, some other resource is to be used by a servlet. Okay. So, for that we use a Requestdispatcher. Okay. So, let us see how we can get the object of Requestdispatcher. One way to get the object of Requestdispatcher is to use the Servlet Context. In the Servlet Context, we have some additional method called getRequestdispatcher, fine, which takes as parameter a string which is a URL, which yes, in this URL the string which we write in the getRequestdispatcher method of the Servlet Context is that you start that string with a slash. The slash here matches the root of the application, fine. So, after our application name slash and whatever it is, here you could use it to access any resource here which is part of the server side. It includes even the web INF, oh, you could have something like you could create a request dispatcher which says /webinf/ something 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 dot even within webinf, if I have some file available, I could use that as a resource and try to forward the content or file, so and use it to create a request dispatcher. So request dispatcher, one way, use servlet context, the method called get request dispatcher, it would return us an object of request dispatcher. We will see how the request dispatcher can then be used to either forward or include them, fine. So forwarding, including, those were the two activities to be done, but for that we need the request dispatcher. One way to create request dispatcher, on servlet context use the method called get request dispatcher, fine. Another way, another one, again on the servlet context itself, we have another method on the servlet context which says get named dispatcher. It takes a string which is the name of a resource and returns the object of request dispatcher. So in servlet context we got two methods, one is the get request dispatcher and other is the get named dispatcher, both of them giving us a request dispatcher. This second one is interesting. The second one says get named dispatcher. What do we specify here? No, here we are not giving a resource URL, there is no URL, the string here would use the name, a servlet name. Recollect, in the web XML we said you create these servlet objects, these servlets are resources, fine, they have that service method, fine, they are capable of servicing. So yes, if you want to create a request dispatcher which maps to a servlet whose entry we have already got as a servlet entry, the servlet name whichever is used here, that can be used in this method called get named dispatcher. You specify the name of a servlet and get a request dispatcher for it, fine. So two methods in the servlet context object to create a request dispatcher, and then we have one more method, we have a method in the servlet request itself. In the servlet request we have this method called get request dispatcher, where we give a string, again a URL, but the difference between the string which we use here and the string which we use in the servlet context, the method in the servlet context we always start with a slash. The method here, which is the method in the servlet request, is if we are specifying a string, fine, the whatever string we are specifying is a string which is relative to the request. This is, see, we have a request object being created. This request was created because of a particular URL. So this is a resource which is relative to the current request. So we can create a request dispatcher relative to the current request by giving some path relative to the current request, fine. So that's, so three different ways of creating a request dispatcher, fine. Now once you have a request dispatcher, now our interest is, okay, I have done my part. See, there are two things, one is I have done my part, let rest of the things be taken care of, I am not interested in putting the response to it. So one option is to use the method called forward. This request dispatcher interface has two methods. One is the method called forward. Forward is where, no, we are not doing anything with the response, fine. So if you use forward method, it is basically going to reset. If you have done anything on the response, it is going to try to reset. The forward would not be successful in case the response is already committed, because it has to reset it first and then it goes to the next. The request dispatcher maps to a particular resource, then it will use that resource to fill the response. It find the responsibility goes to the next one. So that is how the whatever matches the request dispatcher, that is going to be responsible for filling the response to it. So forward, fine. Once you say forward, anytime you use a forward within your service method, what you should do is immediately return from that, do not do any further processing on it, fine. That is what is to be done if you are using a forward method. Another option was, no, we are not interested in forwarding, we are already writing a response. We are writing a response, but as part of a response, some part of the response I would like the other servlet, other resource here to be filling the things here. I have certain things to be filled up. I am not putting that, I want the buffer, I want the other servlet or the other resource to append to the already filled in buffer. So that is something which can be done by using the method called, by creating this, by using this method called include, which is on the request dispatcher. So you could create the method called include. Fine, you could use that method called include. What we do in both the forward and the include method is whatever request and response objects we got in our service method already, we just simply use that same objects and pass it on. Fine, one important thing. Oh, this here. What do we have? What is common between? Because what we did some processing, right? And as part of the processing, we might have computed some results, and then we are asking and forwarding and asking someone else to put the response to it. What will be needed here is the ability to share some objects between the two servlets. Oh, is there anything common between them? Yes, there is something common. We are using the same request object. So, whatever is in this request object, fine, the same request object is being passed on to the request dispatcher. Fine, so that's the other servlet gets the same request object. What can we do here? Having a common object, how does it help? If we look further into the methods of servlet request, we find servlet request has a capability to store objects. Any kind of objects can be put into a servlet request object. So it is actually a place where which can be used for sharing objects. Give a name and store an object. We have these methods. We have these set of four methods here. One method is the set attribute. It's nothing but giving a name, assigning a name, and storing an object. Fine. This is something which can be done in servlet request. So servlet request has this method called set attribute, where you are passing a string and any object which you want to assign that name to. Store that object in a servlet request. So like this, you can store multiple objects. Any object which has been stored, you can fetch it by using a name. The next servlet would probably know the name and would like to fetch by that name. So we have the other method called get attribute, where you pass a name and get the object for it. Fine. Or if someone wants, he can get all the name. Oh, what are all the attributes which have been created in this servlet request object? So we have this method called get attribute names to return an enumeration of strings. Okay. Oh, I have already shared some object. Now I feel no, that object is no longer to be available. I don't want it to be available within the servlet request. I want to stop sharing it. So I can simply use a method called remove attribute, where I give the name of the attribute and that entry for that object goes away. So yes, a servlet request object is something which is capable of storing objects by some name. See, it is a common object between the servlet request and the other request dispatcher. Fine, the other servlet which will be accessible, which will be available through the request dispatcher. Fine. So we have something common here, some objects which can be shared here. Fine. This ability, we call them as attributes. This is nothing but an ability to be able. Fine. This is nothing but giving us an ability to share objects. Fine. Or sharing of objects through a request is one thing. We have still more things. This same concept of sharing objects, we have something which is common across the entire application. Oh, what was that? The servlet context object. It's common across all of them. Fine. The same set of 4 methods again also available to us in the servlet context. Fine. Okay. So we have this methods, same set of methods also available in servlet context. Fine. So add those methods in the list of servlet context, methods for servlet context, 4 methods for servlet context, same set of methods for servlet request. Fine. So fine. With this, I think we can have more meaningful servlets being created, where ability to share objects has also been added to us for us. Fine. And fine. So that's for the current module. In the next module, we'll be looking at exploring the things about HTTP protocol itself, because what we have seen so far is all the things which are part of javax.servlet package. And when we move to the javax, now we will be moving on to the javax.servlet.http package, which is about being more specific towards HTTP protocol. But when we move there, we will come across another thing, HTTP being a stateless protocol, but many times we would like to carry out some transactional things. Fine, like something in a shopping cart. So there we want some of the things we would like to be able to track the user. Fine, for tracking of users, sharing object which is for that current user itself. We will have some kind of an object there which we call as HTTP session. The reason I am bringing that class currently over here is that this same set of 4 methods which is giving us the ability to share objects, we call them as attribute. Find those set attribute, get attribute names and remove attribute. That same set of 4 methods is also available in HTTP session. When we look at that later on, fine, we will be seeing that again. Fine. So, for this session, for this module, fine, that is it. Thank you.